Hello, I do think that I'm live. I wait a second to make sure I don't hear my own voice echoing back at me from the tab that I have open. No, I don't think I'm doing that. Hello, Tamoki and Magdalenus Rex. Nice to see you as always. When is Kirsha ending? Kirsha usually streams for 5 hours at a stretch. She has the gift. I don't know what it is about female VTubers. They have this ability to just yap for hours and hours. When my throat starts to hurt at about the 1 hour and 30 minutes mark. I remember when I first started streaming, I did like 6 or 7 hours in a row, and oh my goodness, that actually left my throat hurting for a good week or so. It felt like somebody had gently scrubbed out the back of my throat with a wire brush. That was agony. It was a very much unpleasant experience in every way. So yeah, that wasn't pleasant. I also do wish to apologize for not streaming on Wednesday like I promised that I would, but I really did feel that circumstances meant that it would be just a bit macabre. No, you don't pronounce the B part, do you? It's macabre, not macabre. Sorry, that's a thing from Discworld. I just felt that with Shondo announcing the death of her mother, and that having so much narrative presence on places like TVA and so forth, I just felt it would be in very bad taste to do a stream like this on the same day as her mother died. That would be unpleasant, especially considering all of the nasty things. I mean, I don't think that it would affect her personally, but it just, like, the empathetic part of me was just like, yeah, I really don't feel like doing that. So I do apologize if anybody was specifically waiting for Wednesday, but instead we're doing it Friday because I am determined to keep up with my schedule. It means I've got exactly 2 days to research the next entire chapter, which is going to be extremely fun. I mean, I have already read a decent chunk of it, but I haven't put down my notes for it, which is going to be interesting. If I absolutely can't manage that, then I'll delay till Wednesday again, and we'll see. But this book is definitely pretty hefty. But we should now be at chapter 4 out of 12, and hopefully the last couple of chapters aren't quite as monumental as the ones we've been going through. But I'm really enjoying it. I'm absolutely delighted with the material that's been done here so far, and I also find that just the act of having this stream to prepare for makes me vastly more diligent when it comes to actually preparing for things and making sure that I'm up on everything. Whereas before, I used to mostly just read for pleasure and quite quickly forget what I'd read, and not so much that I forgot. I've always had a very good memory for remembering events and details, but the funny thing is I often forget the context of those details, so I can remember an awful lot of things that I've read, but I can't quite remember where I've read them. I can remember life experiences, for example, but the weird thing is I find it very hard to remember the names of the people that those experiences happened to. I also apologize, but I need to blow my nose. My nose is surprisingly runny today for some reason, so I do apologize if I have to mute a bit more often than normal to blow my nose. I will just be 1 second. There we go. Those who attacked Shondo and mocked her for her mother dying. Twitter really is one of the nastiest places in all of human existence. It's a place also, I mean, you can see the myth of pure evil in action so much on Twitter, can't you? Is that people just have this attitude of those people that I hate are worthy of anything, whereas those people are... I think the person that I was... Let me just go read it, actually. I think it was something that Rima Evenstar sent me. No, it was something that... I think it was... No, it was sent on my Discord. I was actually sent it multiple times, so that's why I'm confused as to where exactly it came from. Hopefully it's not gone too far up the... Yes, this was on Twitter. This was highlighted by Permaband, or Give Me Banhammer. This was somebody called Laplace or Byoudou, BYOUDOU_. And they said in response to the death of Shondo's mother, I feel bad for your mom because even at her death, you still felt the need to refer to her with your retarded fandom speak to get validation from the absolute bottom of the barrel audience just so you could grift money and pity from them. I'm just like, guy, my man, my dude, my friend, I am a person of fairly strong emotions. It takes me quite a long time to rev my emotions up to the point of genuinely hating somebody, but there are a couple of people that have managed to make me sincerely hate them. It is very genuinely extremely hard for me to sincerely hate somebody, but there are a couple of people that I do sincerely hate and would not be ashamed to say that I hate. But even then, if one of the people that I genuinely hated posted, oh, hey, my mother is dead, I'm not going to say, oh, you deserved it, or, oh, congratulations. Like, even if I don't hate Nolan Crush. Nolan Crush is a bit too pathetic to hate. But if Nolan Crush posted that his mother, I think his mother and father are still alive, it was his sister that died. If Nolan Crush posted that his mother was dead, I would say, hey, Nolan, I know that you think I hate you and everything, but I am very sorry for you. I really hope that you can grieve and you can move past this, because that's the human thing to do. If you are so completely wrapped up in hatred and demonization that you look at somebody losing their parents and go, oh, well, it's disgusting. You're exploiting their deaths for views. There's something seriously wrong with you, and I think you should get help immediately, and it's really depressing. It is genuinely very, very, very depressing and upsetting. Anyway, with that miserable thing, give me just a moment, please, and I'll get to work. I've been very busy today, so I didn't have quite the time that I really wanted to really iron things out in terms of the research that I was doing, but I was fortunate in that I managed to do quite a lot earlier in the week. Because towards the end of this section, there is the opportunity for quite a big tangent that I am going to indulge in because it allows me to get my history cap on for a while. And there's a couple of extra articles that I looked up which were very relevant to the topic that we'll be discussing in this book tonight. Right then, as Rex says, for F's sake, when Chris Chan's dad died, his worst trolls gave him time to grieve. These VTuber antis are less than vermin. I agree. I most certainly do agree. And, like, the major problem is it's funny that Rima Evenstar said to me just earlier after some people may have seen the tweet that I put out earlier about, because VNU at the moment is collapsing, and Rima Evenstar, who, regardless of what you might think of her as a VTuber journalist or drama tuber or whatever, is genuinely a very nice person, and I really enjoy speaking to her. She has never said anything nasty or unpleasant. She was streaming about VNU's apparent collapse, and she watched one of the talent's announcement streams, which they put out publicly, mind you. This was a public YouTube announcement video about their graduation. And in the middle of her watching that stream, the talent took down that video and then posted on Twitter saying, we didn't put this up for horrible drama freaks. We didn't put it up for vultures to pick over our legacy or whatever. And I'm just like, bitch, you put this up in public. You put this up of your own free will, a public announcement, and now you've taken that announcement down. You've deleted the live chat, so all of your fan reactions to that stream are forever gone. You're never getting them back, because when you take down or edit a live stream in any way, the YouTube live chat goes down. So that all of that content is lost forever. you have also massively invoked the Streisand effect, because people who are less moral and nice than Rima are going to look at what you've done and go, so what is it they didn't want people to see? What are we going to find if we dig into this corporation now? What secrets are there to find out that these talents don't want us to see? And of course, nonsense happened on Twitter where a whole bunch of people were like, oh yeah, based, awesome, take it off to the drama tubers, don't let them get anything. And you know what, that on some level that's not totally unreasonable, because there are drama tubers out there who don't have any morals. They're pretty nasty, they're pretty shamelessly farming for content, but at the same time, if you just declare everyone who wants to even just watch and react to your stream as like a drama tuber, you're really, really, cutting off your nose to spite your own face. You need some positive coverage. And the thing is that most people in 2025 are very well primed to take the side of the talent over the company. And so a talent deliberately provoking and engaging in drama to supposedly spite the drama tubers, all that does is turn people against you, which is completely absurd. Pretty much everybody on TVA agreed with this statement as well. And I don't hate anybody in VNU. I have no idea what's going on in VNU. Maybe it's a massive cluster F or whatever. I don't know, but all I do know is this was just a massive failure of public relations and a really stupid thing to do, which is depressing to see in the year of our Lord 2025. They have a sip of my coffee. Oh, hey, Warhammer Space Marine 3 announced. That's nice to hear. I still haven't played Space Marine 2, but I will definitely get to it at some point. But yeah, that's about all that I wanted to say on the VTuber front, although Magnus Rex says, I noticed on HoloLive's side, Shion's graduation has been made with basically silence. I really liked her, but I think everyone knew this was coming a light year away and no Volge can actually spin it. I mean, yeah, that's actually a good point, is that with regards to people like HoloLive as a company in general, the advantage that HoloLive has in its graduations is that, for one thing, the talents that graduate from HoloLive tend to either have only been in HoloLive for a relatively short period of time, or they have been extremely long in the company. And I think that despite all of the escapist fantasy that VTubers provide, the vast majority of people are going to instinctively understand that if somebody joined HoloLive at age 16 or even 18, and has been with the company for 5 years, they are a fundamentally different person than who they were when they started VTubing. Those years are the most formative years of a young woman's life, and it is very likely that after 5 years of doing the same thing, she's going to want to change her horizons a bit. And also, it's been demonstrated multiple times that after you graduate HoloLive, your career can take off in pretty major ways. We look at, for example, Emilia Watson and Fauna. Both of them are currently streaming to very large CCV. They have in no way dropped off. I mean, I know that Doobie dropped off a bit, but I think that was because she stopped streaming for a little bit. And so there's no reason why you can't leave HoloLive and then go on to have an extremely successful and brilliant career. Even people that have, I wouldn't say fallen off necessarily. I'll go so far as to say, I would say that people like Kason have fallen off a fair bit since the quote-unquote glory days of HoloLive. But even then, she streams to an extremely comfortable audience, and she still gets sponsorships, she still gets merch deals, etc. She is by no means on a decline. As Magdalena's Rex says, she, aka Shion, was 15 and a high school dropout and went Menhera because she literally didn't know what it was like outside HoloLive, which was why she had her hiatus. I don't know if she'll return, hoping she does. I mean, obviously, I sincerely hope that any talent that graduates comes back to VTubing in some form or another. Although when I say some form or another, given the certain tendency of VTubers recently to graduate from their corporate jobs and then start turning tricks on the New Jersey Turnpike, I actually think that in some cases it would be better if the VTubers did not in fact return from their hiatuses after graduating. There are some VTubers I most certainly wish had not returned from their previous examples of activity. But then again, that is a whole different layer of cringe and discomfort that I won't go into with great detail right now. But yeah, as I was saying, I think that Hololive has a massive advantage in that the majority of their graduations are basically a case of the people who were their fans knew for a very long time. 1 second. My apologies for that. Just going to knock on my window. What was I saying? Yeah. Yeah, the people... Sorry, my train of thought was just completely disrupted by somebody asking me a question in real life. Yeah, the people that have graduated Hololive are people who have been in the company for a very long time and who have demonstrated in various ways that they want to move on in their life in some capacity. They have prepared and primed their fan bases for those kinds of transitions. And as a result, when they graduate, it depresses some people, but it doesn't necessarily come as a massive surprise. People are resigned to it, and they're not angry at the corporation itself. I know several people that were extremely big fans of Aqua when she graduated recently, but in none of those posts about Aqua have I seen those particular people being upset at Hololive or, any of their subsidiaries or assets for driving out or being hostile towards the talents themselves. No, they've just been kind of resigned and depressed that it's over, but they're happy with the time they had. Whereas in so many other corporations, unfortunately, you very obviously see that, this person is graduating because they had a disagreement with management, or that there was messing around going on behind the scenes that was hinted at and vague posted about, but it wasn't. It was very much a bad breakup rather than a natural, orderly transition from one stage of life to another. Right, anyway, allow me to just quickly look at my notes, and in just 1 minute or two, I will get into the actual subject of today's video, because last video on Monday, goodness me, it alternatively feels like 5 seconds ago and 10 years ago that I did the last stream. So on Monday, our discussion was primarily focused around how the myth of pure evil has existed in one form or another in human consciousness for thousands and thousands of years. We went through various depictions of it in media, such as the children's media that depicts evil in the form of villains or supernatural entities, similarly with horror movies, and also books and religion as well, with its idea of the pure evil devil. Various different aspects of this myth reinterpreted, reinvented, and recreated down and down and down. But we didn't really get into the second section of this chapter, which is entitled Pure Evil in Modern Life. Hello also, Decato, nice to see you. I'm just about to switch over, and then we can begin. And this section, can I actually highlight it on the thing? Will it actually... Oh, no, that is not what I wanted to do, sorry. Sorry, I'm using Microsoft Edge for Microsoft Edge is actually very good for viewing PDFs because it has multiple tools. Like all of this highlighting stuff is stuff that I've done in Microsoft Edge, but it does react a little bit unpredictably. So yeah, this is the section that we're going into right now, Pure Evil in Modern Life, which, as the yellow text says, it examines how the myth of pure evil is used outside the realms of fiction and theological theory, in the everyday affairs of ordinary men and women. And so I will now start to consult with the sacred notifications. Because having explored the depiction of the myth of pure evil in a variety of aspects, Baumeister now seeks to find real-world examples of how this knowledge affects our everyday perceptions and understanding of the world. His assertion here is that this examination will help demonstrate the various psychological functions the myth of pure evil performs. Because a major issue that he brings up over and over again in the previous chapters is how the myth of pure evil is not something that simply exists as an ephemeral thing, but instead it has been constructed by humans because they are they have certain social preconceived notions about how the world works, and these notions are very deeply ingrained. And this part of the chapter will focus on how those social preconceptions and those natural instincts affect how people view the real world. And the first section is crime and evil in the news, and we are very well familiar with how crime and evil are portrayed in the news. And in the first section, it begins by contrasting a pair of news reports, which you can see highlighted here in the beautiful pink text. In one report, a young couple watching television are attacked by a group of men, who beat them both brutally and then leave without stealing anything and without an obvious motive. However, another newspaper reports the same incident, but it adds an interesting detail that is absent in all the other reports. The male victim of this crime was currently being charged with facilitating child prostitution. Now, obviously, the differences in these reports can lead to rather dramatically different assessments of their impact. But Baumeister focuses primarily on how the second report presents the public with a more complete picture, leaving them better equipped to judge the motivations of the perpetrator and see what could have prompted such an attack. By contrast, however, the more sensationalist reports act as if the attack was random and inexplicable, painting a picture of peaceful suburban life that's suddenly disrupted by the intrusion of pure evil. In other words, they perfectly conform to the myth of pure evil. And how many times have we seen this happen in various different circumstances? Also, hello, Kenneth Patterson. Nice to see you. I think one of my greatest examples is... this is more... the trouble is that nowadays the narrative is very much racially and often religiously motivated, especially in Europe. It might be a little bit different for Americans, but I speak primarily from the perspective of a European. In that here, very many crimes... It's a joke. It's a pathetic and sick joke, but it unfortunately true, is that if the BBC reports on a crime, if it's a white person that committed the crime, they will always say it was a Caucasian male or it was a white person who committed this crime. If it was not a white person, they will always refer to the criminal in some abstract way. They will never say it was a black person, or it was an Algerian man, or it was a North African man, or it was a migrant, or it was a Muslim. They will never, ever, ever say those things unless it is incontrovertibly proven by external evidence that they can't dismiss that it was in fact one of these people. And this applies very much in this case as well, in that we can immediately see that the newspapers, both of them really, have certain biases. We don't know exactly why one reported certain details and another didn't. But the point is that one of these newspapers conforms very much to the idea of pure evil, because it's saying, oh, it was just a random crime, they broke into this poor, unsuspecting couple's house, they beat them up, they didn't steal anything. How shocking, how horrifying. Like, I'm sure you can all envision the kind of tone of that particular article, where it's the idea of the other has come into our peaceful community and started a fight. But in the other sense, the small issue is that this was not exactly a wonderful person. He was not a nice person, and you can very much understand why people in the neighborhood may have taken offense at his activities, and upon learning them, would have decided that he needed a bit of street justice. Let's move down to the next page. Now, Baumeister arrives at the point of this whole section, the perception of crime as conveyed to the public by the news media. Recapping the conclusions from previous chapters, he notes that most crimes follow standardized and predictable patterns. These usually involve mutual escalations and provocations, and the victims of said crime are generally of the same social class and race as the perpetrators. Of course, these facts tend to be either glossed over or willfully ignored by the media, for whom sensationalism is of paramount importance. Baumeister particularly highlights the media's obsession with acts of random violence, cruelty, and destruction, which he is then going to illustrate with a pair of examples. So I should not be clicking that. Yes, youths, indeed, Kenneth Patterson. My friend Reinigan, he has an entire list of pseudonyms for black people that have committed crimes. I'll have to ping him, actually, and let me just give me a second to see if... I don't think he's online just at the moment, but he might be... do you happen to have that list of pseudonyms for black traitors of criminal actions that you showed here once? I might even be able to find it. No, I can't find it in that. That's annoying. I will see if I will see if he arrives. He's not apparently on Discord at the moment. Be 1 nanosecond. Ah, delicious, delicious honey and lemon. I've now transitioned from coffee. Youths is a more specifically British one. Oh yes, youths. It was a gang of youths, mate. Ah, dear. British slang, endless source of hilarity. Now, in the first example that Baumeister provides, a young woman is assaulted, brutally beaten, and raped while jogging in Central Park. Now, as might be expected, the media, of course, dwells very heavily on the seemingly random and arbitrary nature of that attack. In the meantime, the second example describes how two men have just participated in a gang initiation ritual, and then they decide to assault and murder a young woman who accidentally intrudes on their event. Obviously, they didn't want to report them to the police. Now, notably, after they murdered her, one of them is caught on camera posing with his foot on her neck. And in this example, the media gives a great deal of focus to the fact that one of the men commented they had made the big time. Of course, the media proceeds to take this to mean they were enjoying the attention that their random act of extremely gratuitous violence upon innocent people had earned them. But that's not quite what Baumeister takes away from all of this, because he contests this point, and he argues instead that the media had no objective way of knowing what the motives of the men were in either of the two examples. Now, this is something that I've had to repeat repeatedly, not so much for my current audience, but anybody who happens to be a VOD watcher. He is not trying to excuse these two actions. He's not trying to say that the rapists in the first example were in some way justified for their rape, although I have unironically seen... In fact, allow me to just tangent a tiny bit. Does this get any hits on Google? No, fortunately it does not. Oh, here it is. Yeah, I no surprise Google suppresses that result. But yeah, I was just thinking of an example in Sweden where there was a migrant who raped a woman, and he was, I believe, given a lighter sentence or even excused completely because his lawyer argued that he was experiencing a sexual emergency and was justified in committing this rape on the basis of that quote-unquote sexual emergency. And I don't know about you, but when I experience the urges that are common to a man, I can generally settle at certain onanistic activities as opposed to, going out and committing an extremely gross and offensive crime against another human being, which should be the natural and normal reaction of most people. So, yeah, I really find... I also realized I'm not on live chat, as always. There we go. Sweden, yes, so consent was implied by being Swedish. You say that in jest, but it would not surprise me if that argument has been used multiple times in Swedish courts at this point. I mean, Sweden is just a meme of a country. Oh, that tastes good. But yeah, as I was saying, Baumeister isn't trying to excuse these people. However, the point that he's trying to make is that the reporters are not actually engaging in any kind of good faith process to ascertain the real facts of the situation. Although it's pretty clear that there would be no excusing factors for these men engaging in these heinous actions, there's obviously a reasonable conversation to be had around the circumstances that resulted in these crimes. But for the most part, the media does not do this. Instead, they much prefer to buy into the myth of pure evil. And I thought there was a chance to... There's something that I looked up previously as well. I will need to go to my other... My desktop audio is off. This is a video, and I thought that we could watch the first couple of minutes of this, because this is from somebody who I used to... when I say I used to respect this person, it's because they're dead. This was Total Biscuit. And I just deafened myself. Let me just scroll forward to the timestamp that I put on this. Give me just 1 second, please. Okay, here we are. Give me a moment to bring this up properly on screen. Right, they're just chatting while I... my computer forcibly restarted itself to update, which messed up a whole load of my settings recently, so it takes me a little bit longer to do this than I normally would, so I do apologize for that. I want to make sure I'm not accidentally showing any information I shouldn't. I'm signed out of everything. Good. I do hate going to YouTube when I'm on the stream, because it's always very awkward. Here we are. It's this video that the creator Total Biscuit put out over 12 years ago, actually, that is called Tragedy in Video Game Violence, which discusses the media culpability in a great deal of detail. It's obviously far too long to watch on screen, but I thought the first 2 minutes of it were very much worthy of consideration, so I will put that on now.
It's that time again, isn't it? It's a sad state of affairs that this should keep happening, but it does. As you are probably aware, a couple of days back, a 20-year-old man by the name of Adam Lanza walked into a school in Connecticut and murdered 20 children before turning the gun on himself. As is sadly usual in these kind of tragedies, we have a great many people, most of them in the media, willing to jump at the chance to make a lot of money from politicizing and covering a tragedy in the greatest possible detail, whether or not that detail is actually true. More to the point, there are strong arguments that the media is essentially an accomplice in school shootings, and as a direct result of intense media coverage, turns the shooter into an infamous anti-hero as opposed to focusing on the victims and what could best be done to help and prevent such tragedies in the future. Speaking on Charlie Brooker's Newswipe 3 years ago, Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist, gave his opinion rather clearly.
Well, if you want to know why not ask a forensic psychiatrist?
We've had 20 years of mass murders, throughout which I have repeatedly told CNN and our other media, if you don't want to propagate more mass murders, don't start the story with sirens blaring.
The school day had only just begun when the attacker struck.
Don't have photographs of the killer.
The 17-year-old's 3-hour rampage ended in his own death.
Don't make this 24/7 coverage.
The German Chancellor is about to give her reaction. We'll bring that to you live.
Do everything you can not to make the body count the lead story.
Carnage in the classroom, 16 people are dead.
Not to make the killer some kind of anti-hero.
Dressed in black combat gear, the gunman opened fire at random.
Do localize this story to the affected community and make it as boring as possible in every other market. Because every time we have intense saturation coverage of a mass murder, We expect to see 1 or 2 more within a week.
Now, before anyone makes the mistake of construing what I'm about to say as a criticism of the American media alone, please note that that entire clip was based on BBC News, which is, of course, a UK-based organisation.
Yes, as we mentioned earlier, the BBC is very, very much culpable in exactly the same kind of activities as just been described there. But that whole video is extremely good, and in fact, I will just pin a link to it in the chat here, because I think that it is very, very good background material for anybody else who'd like a greater understanding of the exact ways in which the mainstream media tends to vastly exacerbate the issues that go on in these kind of situations. Now, allow me to switch back to the previous screen. There we go. Sorry, I've just got something caught in my throat. As I feel very sorry for poor Total Biscuit. He had a very nice run, but unfortunately, I actually managed to meet him in person once before he died. That was quite a sad situation, and I really hope that the rest of his family are doing well in our current hellscape year, 2025. Anyway, with that tangent more or less over, let's go back to the book, because after citing a couple of examples of very obviously melanin-rich persuasion, there are other instances which are worthy of consideration as well. Because in one famous example that was drawn from the Los Angeles Police Department, this concerns an incident where a group of white officers were... I'm sorry, this is a really awkwardly positioned on the page, so it's hard to highlight. There it is. A bunch of white officers were caught on video brutally beating a black man, which promptly made national news as an obvious case of racially motivated violence. The victim was called a black motorist, and various facts were omitted to increase the spin of the story. Now, chief amongst those facts was that the victim was a career criminal and was violating parole, and had just led the police on a high-speed car chase through a major metropolitan area, endangering hundreds and hundreds of innocent cyclists, pedestrians, and also roadgoers. And, of course, it is completely obvious that the media had decided to place the policeman into the role of pure evil, and they weren't interested in letting mitigating facts or circumstances in any way affect their narrative. It turns out we can't all just get along. No, unfortunately. But, I mean, that's something that their book talks about a great deal, is that, yeah, we really can't get along, but the thing is, it isn't so much that we can't get along, because everybody... Our differences... there's this ridiculous saying, which has been abused so much. It's not ridiculous, but the way that it has been abused is ridiculous. Diversity is our strength. Now, that has been another one, a bit like Black Lives Matter, and it has been hideously weaponized and mutilated over the years to be a caricature of what it is. But I still believe that saying. Diversity is our strength, because it is only when you have people with diverse opinions and viewpoints and even ways of life that you can make a proper analysis of anything. Because if you only have one perspective, that perspective can't possibly encompass all of the circumstances or all of the possibilities of a situation. And at the same time, culture as well. It's like when I first came to Ireland. Ireland's palate was potatoes. And that was about it when I first came to Ireland. But since in the 30 years that I've lived in Ireland, Irish cuisine, Irish culture, all of this kind of thing has absorbed more. It's become much more... Sorry, I'm trying to manipulate an aspect of my chair, which has slipped a bit. There we go. Like, Irish culture has become much more cosmopolitan, and that has had bad effects in some areas, because obviously there's currently a migrant crisis, and one can very much argue the Irish government has a massive case of guilt. Now they have singing turkeys. But I mean, I prefer the Ireland now, in terms of its variety, to the Ireland that I remember when I was a child, because my goodness, there's plenty more variety. So there is value in diversity. But we have to also simultaneously acknowledge that diversity means potential conflict. And it's not about... People always try and make sure this conflict never happens, whereas I think that's the completely wrong way to go about it. You should instead work to make sure that when these conflicts do emerge, there are systems and methods in place to deal with them in the least destructive way possible, that people should be prepared for a diverse culture. They should be prepared for diverse viewpoints. Because at the moment, and the left is most guilty of this, ironically, the people that push diversity most of all are the ones who display the most intense bigotry and intolerance towards any kind of attitude, viewpoint, or even culture that is not exactly in line with their internal belief systems. I mean, look at how so many progressive people regard Japan. Japan is an exotic culture. It is vastly different from Western culture, and by their own logic, they should celebrate that culture because it is different from the West, which they claim to hate. And yet you go on Twitter, you look up what the average progressive says about Japan. Oh, look, it's a hive of disgusting pedophiles and nationalist supremacists who hate migrants and who will never allow anything else into their culture. Their language is disgusting. They literally say the N-word every single day. This kind of absolute paranoid insanity about a culture which they should be championing, which just demonstrates how rotten their sayings and their arguments actually are, which is obviously how you shouldn't deal with the potential of living in a diverse culture or society. Hopefully that makes my point. But we're not done with this example by any means, because let me continue. Because Baumeister now highlights the potentially devastating effect this narrative of pure evil can have, because he notes that in the results of the ensuing trial of these police officers that did beat this man, who turned out to be a career criminal, they were cleared of all charges. But of course the media had been going on for weeks and weeks about how these were evil, wicked white supremacists who were attacking a peaceful, loving black community and had assaulted an innocent black motorists, etc., and so on. And so as a result, the black community of LA exploded into a series of extremely violent riots and protests that resulted in many crimes being committed. But even here, Baumeister notes, there are both examples and counterexamples of the myth of pure evil. Now, the first example is centered around a white truck driver who was brutally assaulted during these riots. He was hit in the head, given a concussion, and he required hospitalization. Now, having spent weeks condemning the police officers as being racist tyrants, that very same media now about-faced and named this incident of the white truck driver being beaten up as a prime example of how uncontrollable black rage affected innocent white communities. Because that makes fucking sense, doesn't it? Sorry, I got a bit heated there. Which, of course, once again, they curiously omit from this narrative the fact that after the beating, it was another group of black people that the protected treated this truck driver and then carried him to hospital, which was the act that ensured his survival. Now, of course, that doesn't excuse the fact that black people attacked him in the first place, but of course, it's another excellent example of how the media blatantly will turn on a dime so long as, you know, sorry, I'm letting my own internal biases get me a bit fired up about this, because when I first looked into this, this really, really, really boiled my piss. Really got to me. But as the book states in the second section here, black people threatening the life of a white person was apparently a highly newsworthy item, but other black people saving the life of that same person was less so. Magdalenus Rex, I love diversity as long as it's among Europeans or East Asians. I mean, I think one of the greatest examples of how people can come together no matter what their backgrounds has been my experience with the proselytizing Christian communities that I know in places like Africa and so forth, which I have certain connections to, in that if a black person from those areas arrives in Europe, then it's very likely that we'll be able to have almost immediate connections with him because he has already assimilated large aspects of our culture through being a Christian. Because in Africa, in fact, Africa has a very, very strong Christian tradition. And as a result, it has really been very useful in priming an awful lot of African migrants to properly assimilating into Western culture. It's not the case where an African migrant comes to England or the Western world and is automatically a worse citizen or a refugee or anything like that as a native. Or if they came from, say, what you might call a civilized Asian country or developed Asian country or whatever you want to say. It's all a matter of them having both the proper exposure to Western culture and also an appreciation of it. And usually that appreciation stems from looking back at their own cultures and seeing how they were positively affected. For example, Christianity has been a great enemy of the witch doctors, who used to hold immense sway in various African communities. I remember speaking to a group of evangelical Christians who made it their mission to work in a South African country for many years, and they discussed how their primary adversaries were the witch doctors in these African tribal communities. And they said that the sway that these witch doctors held over the black populace was so intense that there were cases where all the witch doctor needed to do was, say, throw a piece of white mud at the doorpost of a person who had agreed to study to become a Christian with these evangelicals. And as a result, when he saw that piece of mud in the morning, there was a high chance that person would fall down and have a heart attack. Not because they had literally had a spell cast upon them, but that their belief in the power of these witch doctors was so immensely strong that they would have a heart attack at the idea of being given the curse of death by these witch doctors. But a lot of the black converts in the area would very strongly express how liberated they felt now that they had an understanding of Christian beliefs, and they were able to consign the beliefs of the witch doctors to the realm of paganism and the realm of superstition, and instead embrace what they saw as a more enlightened, more egalitarian, and less tyrannical religion. And as a result, those people, when they moved, or if they moved back to, when they moved or migrated to Western countries, they tended to integrate extremely well because they saw the positive effects that Western culture had had on their own well-being, their own personalities, their own communities, that Western people had come to their communities and freed them from the grip of something terrifying, something that had such a psychological hold on their communities that people would drop dead if they were told they were going to drop dead. So yeah, that's my commentary on the whole affair there, which has once again tangented quite extensively off the original topic we were going to discuss. But we will get back onto it's mostly because I don't want to go on massive rants about the media, because goodness me, I could rant about the media all day long. But let's get back to the book, because we are now on page 79. And obviously Baumeister has just a couple of blind spots here. We've already commented on one or two. In particular is the whole issue of what we touched on earlier, is that today's media landscape tends to be very, very focused on the racial agendas of, the interactions between black and white people, between Christians and Muslims, so on and so forth. But his next assertion very much remains true, that racism itself naturally lends itself to being understood in terms of the myth of pure evil. And that's because an essential facet of the myth of pure evil is the sense of otherness, combined with an instinct to view outsiders as a threat. And people who are obviously visually different from ourselves, people with different skin tones or exotic cultural backgrounds or different languages and belief systems, they're very much easier to categorize as others than those we have grown up around or otherwise view as our equals. And again, I'm not saying that it's not always wrong to categorize people as others based on their backgrounds, because it's very obvious that a fundamentalist Muslim is going to have a very strong difference of opinion with me on various different topics. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily make him evil. Like, I know some very, very interesting Muslims that I really enjoy having conversations with. Tamoki, in the Dominican Republic, witch doctors are still a common issue, especially with the gangs. Yes, trust me, I am very much aware of that. There are many stories that I have heard about those people, which is pretty goddamn chilling. But the problem, of course, is that sorry, I kind of got lost for a second. Let me rephrase that. The problem is that instead of trying to pull back from this myth of pure evil, the modern media and academia are really trying to push it. And they're even working on a constant basis to create new methods of pushing people into these arbitrary us versus them categories, such as, of course, race, gender, and sexuality. And I think that his comments at the end of the section are worth reading in full. And it's just this section right here in the middle of the screen. The incorporation of racial conflict into the myth of pure evil suggests one risk in the current American rush to categorize everyone by race and gender. The more people become sensitive to these differences, the more easily they will fall into the us versus them mentality, and the more readily the myth of pure evil will be passed on to the other side. The more people are pushed to be constantly aware of differences, the harder it may be for them to get along. And as he points out, in the history of the world, increased recognition of differences between groups has led more often to conflict and violence than to peaceful cooperation and sharing. America is now making a dangerous gamble on the opposite result. Tamuki, since this reading mentions demons, have you ever watched interviews with exorcists? I have not, actually. Please give me a moment, because that's the kind of suggestion that I like to see. Please give me a moment to note that down in my personal Discord, because I can look it up later, most likely. Also, I just got an important DM, so I'll just take a moment to comment on this before I move on. Somebody is just because with the whole VNU thing, there's also one other thing that's going on at the moment. So I was right up to the wire with this thing. Multiple people have been talking to me about various things. I don't have any sources on VNU, but a lot of people have been commenting on the kinds of things that have been going on with VNU. I just want to make that clear. I have absolutely zero knowledge of the insider events of VNU or anything like that. I am purely looking at this from an outside perspective. Okay, sorry about that brief interruption. Yes, Tomoki, I will look up that. If you want, you can remind me later on Discord as well, because I do sometimes get lost in the source when it comes to reviewing my notes from stuff like this. So by all means, if I haven't mentioned it or anything, feel free to remind me. Especially now that I am no longer on my ADHD medication, so my memory does not tend to be the very best at the moment. Yeah, I do apologize for the interruption. I may once or twice have to just reply to somebody on Discord, by the way, because I don't want people to feel as if I'm ignoring them. So, anyway, the next section as well. Sorry if my train of thought was disrupted there for a minute. Which is, of course, drugs and alcohol, the chemical demons. Because in addition to the themes of racial violence, the myth of pure evil is extremely prominent in the ongoing war against drugs, which has seen so many wonderful and destructive evolutions in recent years. And of course, real-world facts and data are very often totally absent from the narratives that surround the topic of drugs and alcohol. And Baumeister cites a report by The Economist, which made the interesting conclusion that... Is that fully on screen? That's another awkward one. Yes, that drug business in America actually seems to reduce rates of gang violence instead of increase them. And it attributes this to the fact that violence tends to scare away customers and draws the attention of law enforcement, which creates a pretty strong incentive for criminals to create systems that avoid causing public disturbances. And we also tie back into one of the examples mentioned in Chapter 1. What I do like about this book is that it very often recontextualizes material that was previously discussed in the last chapter or the last couple of chapters, because those that have been here from the start might remember the example of Cody Scott, who was a gang member who got out of prison and had a choice between visiting his pregnant girlfriend in hospital or shooting a member of a rival gang dead. And he decided to shoot the member of the rival gang dead. So, Baumeister doesn't downplay gang violence in any way, but he's also pointing out that gang violence has always been a problem, and it's very often ignored by the modern media when it comes to discussing drugs. And in the case of Cody Scott, he points out that Cody Scott used to be a bank robber, and he used to be a violent criminal who was engaged in robbery, extortion, and various other similar crimes. And he was eventually put in prison for this. And what shocked him when he emerged from prison was that because of the advent of crack cocaine onto the streets that he had previously been robbing banks on, the gang members that used to fight over banks to hit and robberies and robbery targets were now just going like, okay, you trade in that street over there, and I'll trade in this street over here. Which is strange to think about, but I should really get my friend Alex, the Economist, on here at some point to discuss things like this, because I think that he would have great insight into these kinds of events that happened. And I also feel it's worth just a brief tangent, because what I see in media a great deal is the idealization of the past. And in one particular way that the past is idealized when it comes to crime, because there's this very strong narrative when it comes to the war on drugs, or narrative surrounding drugs, that before drugs entered the scene on street corners and in gangland territories, gangs were somehow more civilized. There's this concept of the gang as an informal neighborhood watch, or a group of citizens that have banded together because of neglect by the authorities to defend what's theirs, to stand up for their territory, and because they've been denied economic opportunity or any other particular explanation you like, that these people have been... maybe are not virtuous, but there's this kind of dark hero, this anti-hero narrative. We also see it in groups like the Mafia and the Yakuza. Kenneth Patterson, modern large gangs of the US typically operate on a financial model these days. They're absolutely run on a business basis. Yes, I quite agree. And it's really hilarious, because another little tangent is that The funny thing is that I remember watching some YouTube videos about bot rings on YouTube in the last few years, and one of them said, it amazed me. He set up this this kind of, it's not really a sting operation, but he wanted to test out these botting farms, basically, that say, oh, you'll get free likes on Twitter or free viewers on your stream, etc. And he tested them out, and he said that when I bought this service, I expected to be scammed. I expected the guys to immediately run off with my money and not give me anything. Instead, I got a personal assistant who was available within 5 minutes of me asking for them, who was able to precisely time the actions of these bots so they would enter my stream organically, that they offered me a personalized choice of how to run these bots, how to filter them in, how to take them out, etc., and live advice on how to best make it look organic and natural. He said, the best customer service I have ever gotten in my entire life was from these bot sellers, these illegal bot sellers. And compared to how absolutely tremendously awful the customer service of any mainstream, pretty much any can anyone here name even one legal business that has given them genuinely good, fast, and efficient customer service that's not like the equivalent of a mom and pop store where, you know, they're always going to be there, logically. Ah. Oh, that's delicious. So yeah, my point basically is that, going back to the original tangent, from the tangent that I had, is that the media myth and narrative is that before drugs, groups like the Mafia, Yakuza, etc. used to have honor and dignity and respect. And the fact is that's not the case, is that these groups were always violent. They were always aggressive. They were always destructive. Like I have read, I was almost trying to say written there for some reason, I have read numerous documentaries on Al Capone and the gangs of Chicago, which described how violent those gangs were. Again, there's this myth of the gangster as the protector of the neighborhood, or the guy that stands up for the little people in a corrupt system, and it's ridiculous. It's all nonsense. These people were always violent, vindictive, evil thugs. They might have had, again, not to buy into the myth of pure evil, but they had justifications for doing what they did. But what I'm saying is this media portrayal is completely inaccurate, and it's ridiculous. But anyway, let us continue to go down the list. Because all of these inconvenient facts don't deter the media in any capacity whatsoever. And the next example really highlights that, because it says, in a Chicago police investigation of a 3-day gangland war that killed 13 people, there were 2 competing theories that were proposed by the investigatory committee. Now, the first conclusion was simple. The violence was over who had the right to sell drugs in that area. The second conclusion, on the other hand, went much deeper, pointing out that the first shots were fired over a woman who was evidently being courted or likewise pursued by members from each gang. The shootout could likely have been the result of these romantic tensions escalating to the point of violence. Naturally, of course, the media only reported on the first theory. But we've bashed on the media an awful lot right now, so it's logical to question, which Baumeister does as well, why would the media present such a misleading picture? Also, I really do like this comment up here. I only just noticed, men have been fighting over women for thousands of years. Remember Helen of Troy? Ah, yes, Helen of Troy. Oh, sorry, I just got something caught in my throat. I really hate it when that happens. Beeped again repeatedly. Let me just clear all my notifications from Discord because I've got a ton of them all of a sudden. There we go. So obviously the media is a business, and the old chestnut is that companies want to make money, and informing the public is a secondary outcome of their analyses. But media, at least in America, is a free market. competition is available and competition is possible. So why is it that there hasn't just been free media? I mean, we do see it nowadays. We see, for example, on YouTube, and to a certain degree, our beloved Fox News, of people who at least try and inject nuance and, my goodness, pardon me, and reasonable debate into media analysis, but they're still not particularly popular in terms of absolute raw numbers. So why is it that in the free market landscape, there just has not been this rise of media corporations that benefit from challenging this myth of pure evil? Well, I'll quote the book first of all, in that it says, journalists do not see themselves as in the business of educating the public, so much as informing it of what it is interested in hearing about. And another vital consideration that is worthy of taking into account is the attention span of the modern audience, because we all know that... I remember a joke, I think, from the Babylon Bee recently that I found rather entertaining, is that... Zoomers mourn the death of TikTok for exactly 21 seconds, which is all they can attention span can manage. Always bully journalists. I do agree. Journalist hate. Actually, I will be wrong, because remember, I'm kind of a journalist in a certain degree. Maybe journalists in the traditional sense. I want to make it clear, there are some journalists that I genuinely do respect. For example, Glenn Greenwald, I think, is a very good journalist, and I always turn to him for most of the first takes that I get on most of the issues that I'm interested in. I'll immediately go and look at what Glenn Greenwald has to say about them. And quite a few of the very intelligent people that I enjoy the company of, like Glenn Greenwald as well, which is what I consider a pretty decent endorsement. But again, on the most part, we both know that journalists are pretty idiotic and stupid. Sorry, I just messed up my tabs again. That was very clever of me. So in brief, a newspaper can provide a far more detailed, nuanced, and information-dense coverage of an event than a 5-minute news broadcast. So modern journalists, because of the attention span of the modern audience, are very strongly incentivized to grab the briefest of sound bites and write the sensationalist of headlines. People in general are also somewhat to blame because, remember, we're talking about regular people. Greenwald has a checkered history. I mean, I'm not denying that, but I think that Greenwald has very strong principles. He has always been a positively... I wouldn't quite say... He's been a zealous advocate for free speech in all contexts, which I genuinely do respect. And I respect Glenn Greenwald so much because he has stuck very much to his principles despite a incredibly evolving media landscape, because he used to be a liberal. I mean, he still is a liberal. He still is very much a classical liberal. But he was condemned as having gone to the far right because he didn't support left-wing censorship. And now, of course, the right wing are in power, and the right wing are looking to censor people as well, because they've offered criticism over Israel and American involvement in foreign wars, Ukraine, etc. And so now it's the right wing that are very often saying we need to censor and deplatform these people. But Greenwald has always been very determined in saying that no, you must uphold free speech. And he is very much a constitutional absolutist in that he supports the foundations of the American Constitution. Kenneth Patterson, there was some strong evidence he was sock puppeting support in his comment section back in the day. I do read his comment section fairly frequently. I have no knowledge of that whatsoever. Maybe he was? I don't know. But I have never... that would be news to me. I have never heard of that at any point in my knowledge of Glenn Greenwald in any way. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not true. There might be evidence for it. All I'm saying is that I have never seen any such accusations and allegations before. This was early 2000s. Okay, yeah, that's a very long time ago. But anyway, I won't get on too much about Glenn Greenwald because I have discussed my enjoyment of him very frequently in the past. So people in general have become used to taking a single explanation as the basis for their viewpoints. the average viewer nowadays, they don't want, or perhaps it's better to say they have been trained to just take the first thing they see. It's like the first thing you hear about a topic is the thing you will remember the longest. They want to be given explanations that conform to their pre-existing biases, and while journo hate is very real, and I endorsed journo hate, it goes back to the whole nuance thing. Is that you can't 100% blame journalists for deciding to only put out stories that will entertain a select audience, because that audience is the one that gives them money. We see, especially in cases such as, for example, I think Glenn Greenwald is another good example, going back to him for a second, in that Glenn Greenwald used to be the right's darling boy, because he was anti-censorship during the Biden administration and during the first Trump administration, when Trump wasn't particularly strong and the left wing still had tremendous amounts of power to censor and deplatform. And he was like saying, no, this isn't right. Trump deserves a voice along with everybody else. So the right was really, really pro Glenn Greenwald. But then, of course, when the right wing got into power and became censorious, Greenwald fell out of favor, because he said, no, you can't just turn around and do the same thing to them. And so the trouble is that when you present nuance to people, the average person, and again, I'm not necessarily blaming anyone in my audience for this, but the average person on the street, their instinctive reaction will be to accuse you of being in league with the enemy. It won't be, oh, thank you for explaining this nuanced and detailed take to me. I wasn't aware of these facts. Their natural reaction, either because it is part of their personality, or because they have been trained by society to act this way, will be to accuse you of having switched sides and are trying to excuse the other side for doing something wrong. And with all these things in mind, it's pretty obvious why the media takes such a stereotypical view of drug-related issues and crimes. Because, as I just mentioned, the public at large just prefers to hear that drugs themselves create evil, crime, and destruction. Drugs as a whole and all kinds of chemical stimulants are the perfect other that fits into the myth of pure evil, because they cause chaos, they cause disorder, where there was originally thought to be none. And additionally, drugs emphasize the innocence of the victim, which is another major part of the myth of pure evil. Because if you think about all of these small-town communities that have been devastated by the introduction of fentanyl, heroin, crack, etc., all the public perception is these places were perfect and wonderful and lovely before drugs came in, and then they took over the population and they destroyed them, which is a vast oversimplification of the problem. Because a society does not collapse unless it was already pretty unstable to begin with, because societies as a whole are remarkably resilient. Look at the Roman Empire, for example. The Roman Empire went through multiple points of absolute crisis, and yet because its foundations were very strong, it managed to endure for over 1,000 years, if you count the Byzantium Empire, which the Byzantium Empire would definitely count itself. So when, for example, a small town, if crack is introduced into a small town, and suddenly 75% of that small town's citizenry are either dealing drugs or taking drugs, that's a terrible thing that happened. But at the same time, logically, those drugs didn't jump down people's throats themselves. People turn to drugs when there are other forces in their lives that leave drugs as a more acceptable alternative. They're an escape. So you have to ask yourself, why? What was wrong with this town to begin with that drugs came in and they took over so effortlessly, and they converted so many seemingly normal and decent citizens into addicts? And that's also discussing here in, I have to scroll down, 82. Because reciprocal causation, which will be discussed later on, it really flies out the window when drugs are involved. There's no need to ask why a victim was attacked or harmed by a drug user, And conveniently, there's no need to ask why the drug user did what they did, because, obviously, the drugs made them do it. Now, Baumeister homes in on this justification in the next few paragraphs, and he really notes how the drugs made me do it excuse amounts to really very little more than a modern interpretation of that ancient face of pure evil, which happens to be demonic possession. And it aids perpetrators as much as victims because it allows drug takers a very easy escape from the consequences of their own actions, while also allowing society to ignore the more complicated explanations for their behavior, which I have just kind of touched on. And that you don't get a normal, functional, safe society which is randomly overtaken by something like drugs. It just doesn't happen. There needs to be multiple causations. And let me have a sip of water. Now, the same kind of things can be said about alcohol as well, because Baumeister his next points out that the same arguments are very often made about alcohol, and he of course touches on the brief, well, not the brief, but long history of religious organizations blaming alcohol for many violent behaviors. And once again, the facts run contrary to these historical assertions. Of course, he doesn't say that alcohol can't be linked to violence, but instead that alcohol doesn't cause violence. And I find it quite hilarious how he puts this there, because as he notes in a beautifully sarcastic fashion, a glass of sherry will not turn a little old lady into a dangerous bully, nor will a couple of beers set a mild-mannered schoolteacher off on a killing spree. Although, to be perfectly honest, knowing how some school teachers view their classrooms, I think there may in fact be cases where a few beers have set a school teacher off on a killing spree. So, instead, the evidence really does show that alcohol simply reduces inhibitions, and it brings latent but very much pre-existent behaviors to the surface. And this example that he cites here is an interesting one as well, because in a study that was done on college students, where participants were given the opportunity to zap a rival student with electric shocks, they found out that participants were only likely to shock the other student if they had a pre-existing disagreement or dislike of that student. And the quote here says, "The person who had alcohol and was then provoked was exceptionally aggressive, more aggressive than the person who was provoked but had not had alcohol." But on the other hand, students who had not had college students who had consumed alcohol were no more aggressive than students who had not had alcohol, except if the other person had provoked or angered them. So once again, alcohol lowers the resistance to the impulses of anger. And once more, this ties back to a much earlier statement where Baumeister points out that the vast majority of people don't actually need an excuse to commit violence. There's this myth that people are given excuses to commit violence, which he points out is no, that's not true. It's the other way around. People have all the excuses in the world to commit violence. Society basically goes out of its way through violent media or bad circumstances or provocation to justify violence in some form or another. It is the human impulse to not commit violence that is crucial and key to resisting that urge. People are basically the opposite of what the instinctual analysis would suggest they're like. But of course, that leads to the next question, which is, since alcohol and drugs don't cause violence, we'll just scroll down a bit too far, why does that myth persist so strongly in the public consciousness? Because as we have seen, people in general prefer simple answers, and this ties back to many different social issues. And once again, we tie back to domestic violence, because domestic violence is a theme that Baumeister has talked about a great deal in previous chapters. And he again stresses that in many cases, the trigger for domestic violence is a long and complicated exchange of provocations by both parties. I've just got an irritating pop up on my screen there. Go away. But blaming substances, either drugs or alcohol, for domestic violence is very damaging on multiple levels, because on the one hand, if an abuser can say, oh, it was the drugs or the alcohol that made me do it, then they can maintain that as a convenient excuse without having to admit that they were culpable in the act of beating their partner. And on the other side of things, and this is something that is tragically extremely common for women, women will look for excuses to excuse an abusive partner for the acts of violence that are perpetrated upon them. Women will cling on to it's funny, in VTubing, viewers very often say, I can fix her. But the truth is that whole I can fix her statement was originally reversed. It used to be women saying, I can fix him, when it came to a violent or abusive partner. And they would try their best to stick with these people who just turned out to be serial abusers. It wasn't the drugs, it wasn't the alcohol, it wasn't their friends at work, it wasn't any of those things. And there was nothing that woman could have done to prevent that man from hitting her, which is really tragic, because women have died. Women have been killed because of this, and it has had a tremendous impact on the lives of many, probably millions, probably throughout history, hundreds of millions of people, which I just find really, really tragic. Anyway, we're approaching We've got another 10 page. Now we've got about 8 or 9 pages. We are currently at page 84. Yes, we are at page 84, and we've only got a couple of examples left to go, although these remaining examples are rather tangent heavy. Just load up on honey and lemon. Nice. Because the next section, after the wonderful cases of domestic violence that we've examined, is the hated face, enemies in war. Because after Baumeister started with national scale issues at the start of this chapter, and then zoomed in on the domestic household, here he is doing the opposite, as after discussing the myth of pure evil in intimate settings, he's drawing the perspective back to its presence on the international stage. And the very first thing he quotes in this section is Karl von Clausewitz, who stated, "War is inconceivable without a clearly defined image of the enemy." And that's obviously because in war, both sides are very willing to demonize each other, and this is entirely necessary for morale purposes. Soldiers are very rarely willing to fight other humans they have any level of empathy for, and moreover, of course, in democratic nations, wars require popular support. And a very good example of all of this happening was during the Great War and the Christmas Truce. Because the Christmas Truce is sometimes considered by historians as the point where the Great War might have ended. Because it was the point when, in the trenches, after months and months of murdering each other, on Christmas Day, a very large number of soldiers on both sides stood up and said, we're not going to fight today. Instead, we're going to meet each other in the middle of no man's land. We're going to hold parties. We're going to exchange gifts. We're going to socialize as humans. And this was considered a tremendous threat by the commanding officers and higher-ups of the armies on both sides, because they realized very quickly that as these soldiers socialized and fraternized over the Christmas truce, it made them very, very disinclined to go back to their trenches and continue murdering each other. So almost as soon as these news reports of the fraternization got back to HQ was like, no, stop them immediately, we can't let this happen. And as a result, further fraternization was forbidden. And the next time Christmas rolled around, there were regulations in place to make sure that no such reoccurrence of the Christmas truce happened. And this can be seen across all forms of warfare. And I think the American Civil War is a great example of this. Once again, I do apologize, but the top and bottom of these examples is rather cut off by the awkward formatting of the paragraph. But this is an example from the American Civil War, where the Southerner government faced frequent and very severe manpower shortages, primarily due to the overall disinterest of the working class populace to die for a war that amounted to one that was being fought over quite broad political concepts of states' rights or the right to keep slaves, which most Southerners couldn't actually afford to begin with. It was only a very small number of very rich Southerners that were able to afford slaves in the first place. And of course, due to the slave economy, these slaves could be used to farm vast quantities of land. So these Southern plantation owners became immensely rich. And another interesting facet of the American Civil War is that it was essentially the last time in history where private citizens were able to essentially maintain a wartime economy for an entire country against a rival nation, because obviously many of these plantation owners donated their own personal fortunes and the output of their plantations to supporting the war effort. And in terms of individual productivity contributed to the war effort, this was an incredibly high-level endeavor. And one of the only other examples of it in history is the case of Hannibal invading Rome, because Hannibal was able to invade Rome entirely by funding the war himself, using the holdings that his family had in places like Sardinia, which controlled very large silver mines. And there's a very good argument to be made that one of the main reasons why the ensuing treaties of the Civil War occurred, when the Civil War ended, there was a great move to break up the plantations and create a more distributed system of farming in the South. And there's a very good argument to be made that the primary reason why these great plantations were broken up was because the winners of the Civil War realized that it would be incredibly dangerous for private citizens to be able to own enough land and enough material goods to be able to fund what amounted to a civil war against the federal government. And since then, it has been very much a policy in America to make sure that the average person does not have similar access to the equipment and resources needed to pursue such insurrectionist activities. That's once again a whole other tangent I won't go too deep into. My goodness, I'm getting... Sorry, give me a moment. I've got another bunch of DMs, just be a moment. I'll get to that comment in a second, by the way. Rin friend, I can fix him fails. Girl, I like. She was hoping for her emotionally abusive ex to change. Now she is really bitter about men. How do women put up with it and blame the world for it? Confuses me. I mean, basically, it's because women have children, and there have been many examples of the fact that men don't make particularly good parents in terms of caring for small infant children. A great deal of child murders are committed by men who are left alone with crying babies and other infants, and they basically just snap. And they go, I don't care about this anymore. I just want this thing to stop. And so I'm going to bash its head against the wall until it shuts up. And whereas women don't do that. Women are basically programmed to endure that kind of behavior. Because if they didn't endure it, obviously there would be an awful lot more dead children in the world, because parents would have gotten fed up with them and killed them. because young children are generally incredibly annoying, incredibly irritating, and incredibly time-consuming. And you've got to put up with that 24/7, and you've got to give it all your love and affection and everything without reserve because it deserves it. And, yeah. I am not ashamed to say I was a very difficult child because of my autism, and I am unbelievably and intensely grateful with all my heart and soul to my dear parents for putting up with me when I was at my worst and giving me the chances that I had. But yeah, in terms of, to bring it back around to Rin Friend's comments, women will just naturally have the ability to endure hardship much better than men. A woman will endure a situation and cling to the hope that it gets better. A man is better at decisively, well, a man should be better at decisively ending a situation in a favorable way. Men should be able to take action and solve problems. The trouble is that society has taught men not to be like that. But ideally, women should be there for when a situation has no obvious and easy solution. That is why women make very good caregivers of the elderly, because if you're dealing with a person with dementia, for example, a woman is going to be vastly better at enduring the fact that this demented person is not going to get better than a man will. Men have very frequently stated when dealing with their relatives who have dementia or terminal illnesses that they become incredibly depressed, incredibly dispirited and miserable, because they're not able to process the fact that they can't do anything to help that person, that the only option they have available is to endure until that person dies. That's the only thing they can do. But women are much better at that. Curious, but makes sense. Personally, I'm really good with children and I am male. I mean, there's exceptions to every rule. I am very, very much talking in terms of broad stereotypes here. Broad stereotypes. I am not saying that every single man is a terrible parent and every single woman is terrible at making decisions. I am talking in broad stereotypes, please. Anyway, where am I going with this? Sorry, that distracted me quite heavily. We're at page 84. Here we are. So I already pointed out this part about the American Civil War, and of course Baumeister highlights things like the Vietnam War, and he points out that even like drug lords often need to forcefully draft members into violent conflicts because people don't want to get shot. And he also points out that he calls the need to justify one's own aggression one of the perennial problems in war, because he already mentioned the Vietnam War, but he says that the Vietnam War remains one of the best examples of this issue, because American soldiers were, of course, able to achieve a more than 10-to-1 ratio of kills to deaths over their North Vietnamese opponents, yet ultimately the whole American war effort collapsed because of lack of popular support. And I thought this was also a very good tangent to kind of go on, because the Vietnam War is often considered like the nadir of US foreign relations and foreign involvement in wars. And there's a brief video of just 4 minutes long that I would like us to watch together. Which I think is very useful as well. It'll give me a chance to answer a DM that I've been sent, and also give me a chance to rest my voice for a minute or two because I'm starting to get a bit rough-throated. So yeah, I'll just tab over to this, because when it comes to South Vietnam has always been very interesting to me. Magdalenus Rex, when I hear a crying baby, it pierced my ear and I legit short-circuited. Also, Magdalenus Rex, war is an abomination. The people pushing for the Russia-Ukraine war to continue for lofty delusional ideals I consider the closest thing to true evil. I wouldn't go so far as to say true evil, but I can definitely understand where you're coming from, Magdalenus Rex. Also, yes, lol, Cronkite. Drink water. I've got water. I've already gone through a cup of coffee and about 500 milliliters of water. But yeah, let me go back to this one. South Vietnam had a massive problem with corruption, and I always like to give this extra context to things, so I'll mute myself for a moment or two.
For the capital of a nation at war, Saigon abounds with a phenomenal number of young men of draft age in sharp civilian clothes. Saigon cowboys, they're called. It's a war profiteer's economy, fanned by the forced draft of American money. They counted a good year in Saigon when the prices only go up by 25%.
Years of American presence and the tens of billions of US dollars that came with it had transformed much of South Vietnam, creating a false economy that was utterly dependent on that presence becoming perpetual.
Since the U.S. began its big buildup in the mid-60s, millions of dollars worth of goods have entered the country each month. Some economists say 10% or more of the cargo is diverted into black market channels.
With so much money flowing into the country, corruption and crime inevitably grew. Government officials were on the take. So were many ARVN officers. Policemen could not be trusted.
Who benefit from the financial aspect of the war? Generals. Don't deny that. Then they get the money. Then they become a richer. We have a term, and I call it, they are war profiteers. From Thieu and Key down to every echelon.
The Vietnamese had a saying, the house leaks from the roof on down. Cái nhà dốt từ cái nóc nhà đi xuống. And that was, of course, their way to elliptically refer to the ever-present nagging problem of corruption.
They were stealing from us and selling to anybody. Two-man helicopter, you want one of those? They got it in a box in the back. Probably get it for 12,000 bucks if you negotiated strongly. The corruption was endemic, and we tolerated it.
Tons of American goods piled up on Saigon's docks. Some GIs took advantage too. U.S. products flowed out the back doors of PXs. In just 1 year, the black market cost the U.S. military $2 billion.
The impact of the war has disrupted the ancient patterns of Vietnamese life. The cities are crowded to the bursting point with people uprooted from the land and the ancestral values of a rural-oriented society, but who have found nothing to replace them.
Before U.S. troops arrived, 8 out of 10 South Vietnamese lived in villages. By the end of the 1960s, almost half would be crowded into urban areas. Saigon's population tripled to 3 million. Half the refugees had no permanent shelter. Cholera and typhoid killed thousands. Hungry children roamed the streets, scavenging, begging, searching for jobs to do or pockets to pick. Tens of thousands of young women left their village homes and came to Saigon to become bar girls and prostitutes.
So yeah, I think that that video very much illustrates one of the perennial issues that the US had with the war in Vietnam. And I think it's another great example of how buying into the myth of pure evil makes it very difficult to retain a nuanced perspective. The Vietnam War has always been a personal interest of mine, and although of course I hate communism, and the communists in Vietnam were a bunch of violent thugs in many cases. I think they killed something like 50,000 North Vietnamese landowners. Have I been saying Korea rather than Vietnam? My apologies if I've done that for some reason. So yes, the communists in Vietnam very much have an ocean of blood at their feet. But at the same time, we have to remember that Ho Chi Minh, one of my favorite facts about Ho Chi Minh is that Ho Chi Minh was only alive because the Americans specifically sent a nurse to Vietnam during the Second World War to cure him. I think he had malaria or another tropical disease. And because he was working with the Americans at the time to fight the Japanese invasion of Vietnam, the Americans sent a special mission to Vietnam with a vaccine and a personal assistant to make sure that Ho Chi Minh survived his illness and could go back to fighting on the American side. Magdalena Rex, interesting despite how atrocious the Vietnam War was, we never really othered Vietnamese, and I really respect Vietnam and Vietnamese and consider them one of the best East Asian cultures alongside JP. Yeah, I've heard some very good things about the Vietnamese, honestly. But as that video highlighted, the South Korean government was incredibly corrupt, and it was extremely destructive as well. Is that the government that there was basically no confidence in the central government. It was very much propped up on the bayonets of American troops, and the moment that it left, the South Vietnamese population were basically just like, well, sod this noise. We'll take the North as opposed to letting the South rule anything. It was very much a case like in Afghanistan, where all of the effort Afghanistan is such a clone of Vietnam in so many ways. How after the Americans left, the native government was just like, well, and that was it. And there was very little resistance or will to fight back amongst the actual populace of the people that they were supposedly protecting. Kenneth Patterson, Ho Chi Minh also asked for American support against the French, but was rebuffed by Kennedy, and the commies were the ones willing to support him. Yeah, I've read Ho Chi Minh's statement to the Americans where he invokes, because Ho Chi Minh was a communist, however, he was also a nationalist, and he always described himself as a nationalist first and a communist second. And that was one of the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party turned against Vietnam and tried to invade Vietnam, because they realized that the Vietnamese communists were far more nationalist than they were communist. The irony of the Chinese invading another country for being nationalist goes unstated, of course. Oh, sorry, I've got I've got an aching leg because it's quite cold in here at the moment, and it's getting to my poor ancient joints. I am slowly crumbling to pieces at the ancient age of 33. Sorry, let me just answer this DM. My apologies for that. Magdalena Rex, Vietnam had no cultural revolution, so they still deeply respect tradition and cultural norms and didn't enshrine being abusive on a social level like Chinese are. Very kind and respectful people. Yeah, I would love to visit Vietnam at times. I've known several people that have gone to Vietnam, and they've all had very good things to say about it. Although they do say that prostitution is like so totally endemic in Vietnam that even gas stations have their own prostitutes, so yeah. It's not exactly the perfect culture by any means. Also, allow me to blow my nose for a second, one moment. Fill her up. Oh, guess. Shut up, Kenneth Patterson. Oh, dear. Oh goodness, why am I being spammed by DMs during my streaming? Oh well, I'm literally replying to them while I'm streaming, so I can't exactly blame people for continuing to talk to me. Okay, we're at page 86, so not too much more to go. Let me continue before I get massively distracted even further. What page are we on? 85. So, after discussing things like South Vietnam, Baumeister now turns his attention to the propaganda that was present during the Second World War. Both World Wars, actually. Now, first of all, he notes how British propaganda routinely portrayed the forces of the German Empire as horrific caricatures that played perfectly into the stereotype of pure evil. The vile Huns were accused of every sort of atrocity, such as butchering swaddled infants in captured territories. Of course, after the war, many of these were revealed to be either outright fabrications or gross exaggerations. And that's a very, very standard tactic in war. Both sides accuse each other of atrocities all the time. But I think a much more human-focused look at this is in this is in this section here on page 86. Because even more graphic was the demonization of the Imperial Japanese during World War II. And here Baumeister cites John Dower's book War Without Mercy. And in it, he notes the excessively violent acts committed by American GIs on Japanese prisoners as a result of the propaganda they had been fed. And these atrocities included things like the defilement of corpses and the indiscriminate murder of survivors during naval engagements. And the instances that these activities occurred were far, far in excess of any similar instances that were recorded on the Western Front with American soldiers engaging against the Germans and Italians. Now, if anyone knows anything about World War II and the nationalist Japanese propaganda itself, is that they also portrayed the Americans as horrifying monsters who wanted to destroy the Japanese people completely. So there was a great deal of mutual provocation here again, of which goes against the myth of pure evil. But the problem was that because they had been so pushed by the American kind of propaganda, the Japanese, as a result, they bought into it, basically. They had been primed to it. Let me go back a bit. The Japanese had been primed to expect the Americans to act like monsters. And the Americans had been primed by their propaganda to expect the Japanese to act like monsters. And so therefore this resulted in a massive mutual escalation in the violence between people, because all these instances contributed in turn to the Japanese perception that the Americans were the demons they were depicted in their propaganda. And as a result, they fought to the tooth and nail, leading to this environment of mutual brutality where neither of the sides involved was willing to give any level of quarter or extend mercy to the others in any circumstances. And I'm reminded of the recounts of there was I think Japanese-American GI who served in the Pacific Islands during the war against the Japanese. And he was able to speak fluent Japanese. And what he would do is he would take things like cigarettes and chocolate, and he would sneak out of his camp at the night, and because he had lived in these jungles as a child before moving to America, he was able to stealthily infiltrate the camps of Japanese soldiers that were just a few hundred meters away from the Americans during the night, and he would actually disguise himself as a Japanese soldier. And he would engage in conversation with these Japanese soldiers, and he would talk to them about their perception of the Americans. And he would leave them gifts, and at the end of the night, he'd reveal who he was. And he was actually able to get dozens, even hundreds of Japanese soldiers to surrender peacefully by demonstrating that their perception of the Americans as these hideous monsters who were waiting to slaughter them, skin them alive, and rape their women wasn't actually true. Well, to a degree. And so he was able to save hundreds and hundreds of lives and de-escalate a tremendous amount of lethal encounters because of that ability to extend empathy and cut through the barriers that had been arbitrarily set up by both governments to prevent their soldiers from seeing each other as human. And as Baumeister also comments in this highlighted green section down here, is that Americans did not act this way normally. When they were fighting against the Germans and the Italians on the Western Front, there still were, but there were far fewer recorded instances of prisoner murder. There were far fewer instances of the defilement of bodies or other atrocities committed. And it was only when they bought into the myth of pure evil as it concerned their enemies, thanks to American propaganda, that these GIs were able to desensitize themselves to the point they were willing to commit these kinds of vicious atrocities. Rinfred, that wage of the women part remains a bit true today. Those yellow fever Americans, man. I mean, I'm not going to comment considering, well... No, I won't comment on that. I won't comment on that. You've got that thing. Sorry, I need to blow my nose yet again. Magdalenus Rex, I totally don't have yellow fever. I just noticed 9 out of 10 of my crushes tend to be of East Asian descent. Total coincidence. It's funny that, because I know a Chinese American, no, a Chinese Canadian actually, and she was discussing her boyfriend to me a while ago, and she was commenting on how she's the one that does all of the... He does no housework. She does all of the dishes. She takes the trash out. She cooks all the meals, and she takes care of the house. She does all the ironing, etc. And I'm like, and she's close to her boyfriend. Her boyfriend sounds like a nice guy apart from that, but she was highlighting all of these things, and I was thinking to myself, how many white women would do this for their boyfriend? Like, if I had a girlfriend who was willing to do all of that, I mean, for one thing, I would feel immensely guilty if she was if I was working a 9 to 5, okay, if I was working a 9 to 5 job being a central provider, then you could justify her doing all the housework and the dishes and the cooking, etc., because that's a balanced relationship, okay? You're being the breadwinner, she's caring for the home. That's a natural relationship. But if I wasn't working full-time and I was lazing around and not doing any of that stuff, I would be so guilty. That is so not the way I was raised. I mean, I probably do less than I should in my house overall. I'll admit, because I have a very, very proactive mother who does an awful lot of stuff even though she's not supposed to, because she's ill. But goodness me, I don't understand how Western men can get such good girlfriends in Asians who have such... Because regardless of how you think about Asians in terms of any other aspect of their personalities, they are very, very duty-bound. They will do these kinds of things for you, and they will consider a duty they must do. And, like, to take advantage of that by not contributing is really not nice. That's not a nice thing at all. And if somebody ever called me out for doing that, I hope I would never get to that stage. I mean, I'm autistic. I don't read signals very well, so maybe I would. I'm not claiming to be perfect or anything. Like, that would be fully justified in calling me an asshole for doing that. Like, I really dislike it when I hear about Western men getting with people of Indonesian, Chinese, Asian, Japanese descent and being like, oh, great, this woman is amazing. She does everything for me. I don't have to do anything. Like, no, that's an asshole way of doing things. You should respect and reciprocate that. Because, goodness me. Anyway, that's a bit of a rant. I'm sorry about that, going on that tangent. Where are we? We're on 86 again. Sorry, I keep getting distracted by the tangents. It's because it's full moon at the moment and my brain is just kind of fizzing away. Anyway, back to the book. Another dubious benefit of successfully branding the enemy a source of pure evil is that they can be blamed for all the misfortunes and suffering that the correct side endures over the course of the war. In other words, when the good side suffers, the evil side is at fault. When the evil side suffers, well, that's just their repayment for being evil in the first place, isn't it? And a pretty classic example of this is the Crusades, which are commented on. There's also a bit about the Jews, but frankly, I don't feel like talking about the Jews right now, please. Regarding the Crusades, a classic example of how powerful this mindset can be, both positively and negatively, is the Crusades. And most people who embarked on crusades never actually returned, regardless of whether they were victorious or not. And they fought against very entrenched and capable, deadly enemies while very far from home. And starvation and disease were extremely common on crusader trails. Thousands and thousands of crusaders died in really, really horrible circumstances. But in spite of these very serious odds, and the sheer religious fervor of so many of these crusaders and the belief that God was on their side was enough to win back Jerusalem and win several great victories over the Turks and... Thank you. Oh dear, sorry, my stream elements is below everything else, so I didn't actually catch who... didn't actually catch who subscribed, so apologies, whoever that was. But thank you for subscribing anyway, I do appreciate that. But the book really highlights the Children's Crusade as an example of this mindset that's taken to its just absurdly self-destructive extreme. Because the Children's Crusade led to... And you know what? Actually, I'll just read this part out. It says, in 1212, two boys reported visions in which God told them to lead an army of innocent children to liberate the Holy Land. Children from the towns and villages of Central Europe came and followed the boys. The large groups of chanting children walked to Italy. The Pope sent some of them home, but many died of disease or starvation along the way. Many others were reportedly sold into slavery by the Italian merchants who disingenuously offered to ferry them across the Mediterranean. And, of course, these people were motivated by their single-minded belief in the purity of their cause, which, as a Christian, there's a lot of things that I would do out of a sense of purity for the cause that I believe in. But that won't stop me from saying that some things are ridiculous and stupid. One of my a firm cornerstone of my beliefs as a Christian is that Christian beliefs are inherently, or at least Bible-based beliefs, are inherently sensible and worth following. And yeah, I don't recall anywhere in the Bible where it says, take thousands of children on a crusade halfway across the known world to somehow liberate the Holy Land. Like, I don't remember that being in the book of Deuteronomy or anything. Mantlinus Rex, if I had a girlfriend from East Asia, my constant mindset is I'm not good enough, I must do better every day. Well, I mean, at the very least, that's a productive mindset. I don't think that that's maybe the most healthy mindset to have, but hey, it's much better than going, oh, I've made it, I can stop doing anything. Kenneth Patterson, we're called to be as harmless as doves, but also as wise as serpents. Yes, I think the rendition that I like is be as cautious as serpents and yet as innocent as doves, which I think is a pretty good rendition, personally. Sorry about that. Anyway, let's go to... Yes, it's... 88. So we're in this part of innocent victims now. And after noting the victimization of children during the Crusades, Baumeister is now turning his attention towards innocent victims in general, but perhaps in a different way than one might expect. Now, first of all, he inquires why the myth of pure evil exerts such power and influence when it so rarely corresponds to reality in general, because we've discussed in very great detail how the myth of pure evil really is a myth. But first of all, he reminds us that ambiguity is the enemy of the innocent victim, who believes from a clear-cut, one-sided view, who benefits, rather, from a clear-cut and one-sided view of an altercation. Now, in addition, Baumeister states that when events involve clear ambiguity, it is a natural tendency of humans to settle on the belief or conclusion that naturally favors their pre-existing preferences, and this often boils down to a belief in the myth of pure evil. Clearly that was in the Ethiopian Bible with its 88 books. Also, I'll just be AFK for 20 seconds. I need to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back. Chat, it's cold. It really is freezing at the moment. Really, really cold. Oh. At least I'm not overheating. Where was I? Ah, yes. It's down at 88.5. Here we are. It's natural for humans who experience misfortune to seek logical answers. It is a deeply ingrained part of the human psyche to search for answers after experiencing hardship, suffering, or personal injury. And it's equally common for people to want to believe that their pain isn't their own fault. And that's why Baumeister is now delving a little bit deeper into the psychology of victimhood down here in page 89. And he states that explanations which free victims from blame are very strongly appealing. Now, it's obviously possible for our conscious minds to rationally analyze and debate a sensitive topic. I mean, we're doing it right this moment. But our primal and unconscious minds are very deeply averse to such speculation. And this instinct is something that is rooted in self-preservation, as maintaining the status of an innocent victim is beneficial. Meanwhile, admitting responsibility for being the architect of your own suffering is a near certain way to lose sympathy, and therefore all of the indulgent things that come from having sympathy. And you know, we see this an awful lot in VTubing. I think this is very relevant for VTubing as well, because I posted, I'm not sure if anybody who is here follows my Twitter, but I made a long kind of ramble post on Twitter about the whole VNU thing recently, like an hour before stream, I think, where I said that somebody in VNU was complaining about drama tubers not reaching out to them, and I just said on Twitter, well, a large part of that is because they don't want to actually tell you the truth. They want to tell you a biased narrative that will make you sympathize with them, that allows them to get away with anything naughty they might have done, or anything that might make them look bad. And the problem is that if you go into things with a nuanced mindset, you're going to naturally start assigning blame between both parties. You're going to say, okay, the company did something wrong here, but you are kind of silly for registering for that corporation in the first place without doing your due diligence. Or, hey, you were given this donathon of like $30,000. You only accounted for spending like $15,000 of it. What happened to the rest? Would you like to answer that, please? And so an awful lot of VTubers, they act as if journalists and so on don't reach out to them, but at the same time a lot of them don't even want to speak to journalists under any circumstances, because the less that is known about their circumstances, the more easily they can play things off as them being the eternal and permanent victim. You might want to refresh Kenneth Patterson, because there's no problems here whatsoever. My connection is perfectly strong. It's no dropped frames, 4 green bars of signal. There's no problems on my end. Now, fortunately, Baumeister is very mindful that the reader might have trouble fully assimilating these points, and so he encourages them to engage in a brief mental exercise. And I'm going to read this part in full as well, because there's not really much point in trying to summarize it. And he says here, a good way to appreciate this process is to imagine the choice you face when you have been injured by another person. One possibility is to blame yourself. I started this, so I deserved whatever happened to me. Clearly, this is not a very pleasant or comforting explanation. In fact, if you decide that you deserved this misfortune, then perhaps you will deserve others, and the future can start looking rather bleak and depressing. Another possibility is to decide that the problem was simply a difference of opinion or a problem of communication. You decide that no one is to blame. And I vibe with this a lot, because it's something that was a big part of my upbringing too, is that my parents very much encouraged me to have this kind of attitude. They wanted me to consider, when I had been hurt or upset, the other person's point of view and whether or not I played any particular part in the outcome of events. And once more, it is difficult, very difficult to do. And he admits later on, just in the next section, he acknowledges that engaging in this process is often very unsatisfying, because, once more, it's a natural instinct to blame the other person instead of oneself. And it also does have some drawbacks, because it gives, if the other person that you're trying to excuse is genuinely completely unrepentant, like they happen to be the kind of person that doesn't see themselves as having done anything wrong, which he claims is rare, but we know, of course, does actually happen sometimes, then you're giving that person a chance to really downplay and minimize their own actions. And once again, this is a very gendered thing as well, because Rinfriend brought up how women can excuse abusive partners earlier. Well, I started talking about it first, but then Rinfriend continued on about it and gave a bit more context. Is that this is something that abused women do an awful lot, in that they habitually engage in this self-condemning attitude. I almost said self-excusing, which is the complete opposite of what I wanted to say. They engage in this self-condemning attitude where they constantly view themselves as the one that is at fault in any altercation that involves them being victimized. And after they have had this perspective for a while, it becomes incredibly difficult for them to think in any other way. So there are good reasons sometimes to not use this approach of thinking, am I the one at fault? However, as a baseline, it is what I would call definitely superior to buying into the myth of pure evil. And to his credit, Baumeister really doesn't shy away from the need to speak in very frank terms about how hard this approach can be, because it's just very, very easy to memorize these kinds of approaches in a clinical and objective manner, but it can be next to impossible to implement them when the time actually comes. And that's seductive. This is the appealing and seductive nature of the myth of pure evil, because it neatly plays into all of those natural human instincts, which, when they're indulged repeatedly, can be built up into a framework of justifications and excuses that make it very easy to absolve oneself of any guilt or culpability. You can fall into this attitude of always considering yourself the completely innocent, virtuous victim. How would you, Magdalenus Rex, how would you pathologize how Mickey Nico constantly considers herself the victim of evil haters? Pathologize. That's an interesting... Sorry, let me reply to this. I would say with Mickey Nico, it's very much a toxic cycle. I think that she is quite possibly a narcissist who is almost incapable of seeing herself as the wrong person in a situation. Although, again, that's very much armchair psychology there. But at the same time, I would say at bare minimum, she does have that very much womanly ability to pick through the reactions to something that she has done and isolate from that the one or two, or maybe not one or two, probably like tens or dozens considering the size of her online presence, maybe even hundreds, because I mean, she gets hundreds of thousands to, even millions of eyes on her whenever she does something stupid. She can pick through the responses to those events, and she can find the examples that justify viewing herself as a victim. So let's say she does something and 1,000 people all say, this was a good thing, or, oh, that was a bad thing, but I understand and I still love you. I hope you do better. Then she is the kind of person who will go through those 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 responses, and she will find the 10 or 100 or, 1,500 at most, like 1% of comments that go, oh, look, it's that stupid bitch again. I can't believe she's still doing this. She's learned nothing. She can't change. She's horrible. And from that, she will create this framework where that very small amount of criticism and critique can be turned into an enormous justification for just doing whatever the hell she wants. And the fact she's always a victim and everybody else is wrong and doesn't understand her. It's just really, really awful. Really, really stupid. So let me... Typically enough, everything has happened. She has been cast out of the garden and is made to crawl on her belly. That's a really funny way to put it. And again, I think one of the more revealing examples is when she was it Rust or 7 Days to Die? It was one of those games. The trouble is I can never tell the two apart because I've never played either of them. Where she really made a complete fool of herself trying to get in with this, trying to be a groupie of this really famous streamer, and it was one of the most embarrassing things that I think I've seen anybody ever do online. It was really, really depressing, which I think is a massive reveal of her personality, because she was clout chasing in the most extreme and obvious way, and betrayed everyone the second she thought she had an opportunity to get with this much bigger and more important guy. So yeah, I don't have much sympathy for Rusia in any way, and I think that she very much deserves her current fate. But again, to not buy into the myth of pure evil, I can at the same time understand how she would feel the way she does. I don't agree with it, but I think that while she has no justification to be as bad as she is, I can see the ladder that she climbed in order to reach the cuckoo land that she lives in at the moment. And I can, if I focus in on it, I think I can understand each individual rung that she climbed in order for it to get to where it was. Ah. Oh, then, where are we? Yes, 90. There's only a couple more pages to go through. So this section concludes with a reminder that self-esteem plays a really vital part in the perception of the myth of pure evil, and I'd like to just read this final section here, where it says, "It is more comforting to conclude that the world contains evil, malicious people who attack innocent victims for no reason than to believe that one's sufferings are the result of one's own poor judgment and ill-advised actions that provoked a violent response from someone else." Which, in a way, I should have probably read before I even started to pathologize about Mickey Nico, because Magdalena Rex would probably agree that this sums up a great deal of the problem that she's currently going through. It's basically what I said, is that she'd much prefer to buy into the idea that she's an innocent victim who is being attacked for no reason than she would to pause and self-introspect and analyze why exactly she's doing the things that she's done and why exactly her situation is as bad as it currently is. Ah. Okay. So we're on to our very final section here, because the very last section is, but what about reciprocal violence? And throughout this book so far, Baumeister has repeatedly demonstrated how violence and aggression are most often the result of mutual provocation and escalation. Which brings us to the vital question, which is highlighted here in yellow. Can our image of evildoers really be irrelevant to the majority of actual cases of violence? And to help answer this, Baumeister turns to a classical work of human psychology, and that is Hans Toch's Violent Men. And Violent Men is a book in which is discussed numerous cases of reciprocal provocation and the reasons behind them. And the cited example is concerning a pair of white policemen entering a black neighborhood to investigate a possible violent altercation. And yes, gentlemen, we have indeed gone back to the joggers. And the simple summary of this altercation is that the policemen approach a black man to ask him for information about the violent altercation they've been sent to investigate. And in response, of course, he insults them and threatens them, or at least they perceive themselves to be threatened. And as a result of feeling threatened, they decide to ask him to show them his hands, which he had in his pockets, to prove that he isn't carrying a weapon. He, of course, refuses, and as he's refusing, his friends start to gather round, and they start to insult the police officers as well. And this culminates in the police officers handcuffing the man, who is still screaming abuse and threats, and they drag him away in their squad car. I think we can all agree that this is an example of something that happens an awful lot in suburban America on a regular basis in various places. Now, obviously, we're all pretty pre-programmed to place all the blame in this situation on one of the two parties, depending entirely on which side of the political spectrum you happen to fall into. Pardon me, sorry, my throat is starting to go. It's been 2 hours, 20 minutes, urban, not suburban. Urban. Sorry, I do apologize for that. But in typical fashion, Baumeister encourages us to look at the situation with a level of nuance. And he highlights facts like how the black man later on, both of these groups are interviewed. The black man is interviewed and the policemen are interviewed to get their story. And in his interview, the black man claimed the policeman refused to accept his statement, which was later found to be objectively truthful, that he was totally uninvolved in the incident that they were investigating. And he also said that they were the ones that escalated the conflict because one of the police officers reacted to one of his insults by hitting him in the face. Now, he also claimed that rather than being the start of an angry mob, the friends that had been there, that had gathered around him after this altercation got heated, they were worried about this turning into a case of racially motivated police brutality, and they wanted to be there to provide witnesses and prevent the abuse of their friend by these white police officers. Now, when the policemen were interviewed, they felt justified because, from their perspective, they had been aggressively provoked by an uncooperative suspect and then had been forced to drag him away from the area to both continue interrogating him and also to defuse the situation by removing the source of provocation from what they saw as the potential of a racially motivated riot by his friends who they claimed were gearing up to attack them. Just adjust my headphones. I've got a weird feedback in one ear. That's annoying. Now, the most important part of all this is that... let me scroll up a little bit. Is the fact that both parties recounted the events that use a framework provided by the myth of pure evil. Because both of them felt as if the circumstances fully justified their behavior, and they assigned all the blame that happened during that encounter to the other party, who they saw as solely responsible for the situation. So the policeman completely blamed the black guy completely blamed the policeman. So it leaves the question of, well, who the hell is actually correct? Baumeister is not he isn't writing this book to give judgment upon this whole situation in any way. And that isn't the point of this example, but instead he highlights nuanced details, like the policeman admitted he was provoked by the black man's comments into demanding he prove that he wasn't carrying any weapons, and the black man also admitted that he called the policeman a stupid bastard just before the policeman hit him. And it shows once more the primary weakness of the myth of pure evil, because neither of these groups were able to acknowledge the mutual provocation that took place between them. Which is, of course, something that has been discussed at great length during this particular chapter. Give me just a second to have another drink. I am getting to the bottom of my bottle, and there are several lemon seeds at the bottom of this bottle, which I have to be careful not to accidentally swallow and choke myself. So, if this stream abruptly ends with mysterious gagging noises, then it's me choking to death on a lemon pip. Now, that would be an inauspicious way to end my streaming career. Now, yes, let me go down a tiny bit here, because that's page 93. There's only 3 more pages to go, and there is a couple of tangents that I'm going to go on before we end, because there's a couple of historical examples here that I think are worthy of highlighting. Now, this Baumeister, of course, notes that similar patterns are found over and over, and even terrorists who you'd think would be the stereotype of people that simply want to kill innocent people for no other reason than it's for the cause, they seem to conform to this pattern. It says here, one scholar observed how striking it is that despite the great diversity of causes that terrorists represent, their rhetoric has broad similarities. They all tend to speak as if they were engaged in a battle against the forces of evil, who have somehow amassed great power and numbers on their sides. To the terrorists, they are the ones fighting for the real victims, and their just cause is so desperate that they need to resort to any tactics they can find. And I think that's Kenneth Patterson. A couple of comments, actually. Magdalenus Rex. Both Russia versus Ukraine and Israel versus Palestine was years upon decades of mutual provocation. Yes, and I'm very glad that somebody brought that out, and it's convenient for this section as well, in that And again, in the media, you're not going to find any level of this nuance. In fact, I think that I don't even have it, but at the moment, because I think it's in one of my encrypted hard drives, which I encrypted because I was worried that Ireland was going to criminalize a great deal of crimes, like having memes on your computer, but fortunately they didn't. Anyway, there was a collage of images about Western media's analysis of the situation in Ukraine prior to the 2022 invasion and after. And prior to it, the collage is all like Ukraine, the dangerous right-wing terrorist groups acting in Ukraine, or Ukraine, the most corrupt right-wing government in all of Europe, or Ukraine, the secret of the radicalized youth, or the radical youth camps that are resembling of the Hitler youth. So there was this broad acknowledgement of these right-wing forces within Ukraine, these right-wing nationalists, I know, just made Linus Rex. That was hilarious. That actually reminds me. I remember Remy Down Under was covering the Russia-Ukraine, the start of the Russia-Ukraine war on the night that it happened, and there's this instant. I'm not sure if this stream is still up, but. Remy Down Under is a big fan of VTubers as well, and in the middle of his talking about Russia-Ukraine, there's this guy that comes into his chat and says, "Hey, did you hear Russia just got terminated from Hololive?" And it's like there's this moment of complete incomprehension from him, where he's like, "Russia? I'm talking about Russia. What the?" And it's it's this really funny moment. I'm sad they don't have a timestamp of it, but it's really hilarious. And it was just this moment, I forgot that Russia was terminated the same day, within an hour or two of Russia and Ukraine going to war. That's just absolutely peak clown world universe logic. Anyway, as I was saying, oh dear, sorry. Oh. Sorry, my throat is just is getting on the way of going out by now. Yeah, before the invasion in 24th of 2022, Ukraine was well known as this hotbed of right-wing nationalist activity, and of course, the moment that Russia invaded Ukraine, the media narrative flips on a dime, rather, and goes, "Oh, Slava Ukraine, the bastion of democracy and wholesomeness in Eastern Europe that must be defended against the vicious imperialist nation of Russia at all costs," and neglecting tiny little details like the fact that Ukraine and Russia have been fighting over the Donbass since 2014 rather, and that there are millions upon millions of Russians in Ukraine who identify as Russian citizens, not Ukrainian citizens, and the areas that Russia invaded are ones where these ethnic minorities of Russians, which number in the millions, have repeatedly voted to join Russia as opposed to stay with Ukraine. And Ukraine has never acknowledged and has even gone to violent war to keep these parts of its country. Of course, I'm not saying that Russia is justified in invading Ukraine, but my point is, once again, that the details of the situation are simply do not align with the conventional narrative, and it's about being able to investigate these narratives for yourself in an impartial and pragmatic way that enables you to get the truth about things. Anyway, let us go back to the material again. I'm getting yet more pings, of course. Oh dear, I really wish the VNU stuff would calm down. I'm getting so many DMs about it. So next up, we get the examples of the studies of repressive governments, because, again, Baumeister comments that things flip around, because with the whole mutual provocation aspect and the inability of either side to view itself through the lens of the other side, is that when in a war where a repressive government is pushing back against a terrorist organization, both sides will view the other as the one who is causing all of the death and destruction, because a repressive government will view the terrorists as the ones that are causing all of the problems, whereas, of course, the terrorists will say that, no, we're justified because we are the ones that are standing up for our beliefs, and we are standing up after we have been repressed and prevented from... Sorry, I gotta pop up, go away. Bugger off. There we go. From expressing our voices in the manner that we would prefer to do. And the Spanish Inquisition is, of course, a pretty classic example of this, as it was an organization that felt that it was defending Christianity against heretics and people that were seeking to destroy it, and indeed many of them were. There's no denying that. There was also the terror that followed the French Revolution that was driven by the view that the forces of traditional monarchy would not stop at any lengths in order to restore the Bourbon dynasty back to the French throne, which was also somewhat true. And then, of course, there was the Stalinist and Maoist purges in Soviet Russia and Maoist China, which were prompted by what they saw as the intrusions of Western powers and Western capitalism onto them as... And of course, Mao in particular was prompted by the attacks by Japan, and Russia was invaded by Germany, so even the people who caused the most death and destruction still don't view themselves as evil, because they are only responding to the kind of behavior they feel has first been perpetrated upon them. And if we scroll down a tiny bit to see where it is, yes, the next part is the one that I really want to delve into a little bit before I end stream, because this I find absolutely very fun in a not fun at all kind of way. So Baumeister starts this next part by saying, so far he has argued that the myth of pure evil tends to blind people to the reciprocal mutual causes of violence. Even people who appear to outside observers to be clearly the aggressors tend to see themselves as being the virtuous victims. Their victims do not seem to them like helpless innocents. And this Chapter 2 also commented extensively on how the Nazis viewed themselves as justified in their pursuit of genocidal warfare against other groups. And once again here it highlights that it might seem preposterous to us that groups like Argentinian torturers or Nazi killers could possibly view themselves as justified in the actions they perpetrated on other people, but once again, the fact is that violence has generally reciprocal causes, as opposed to simply springing out of nowhere. And all of these groups that are condemned as evil can often continue to see evil coming from outside, even long after they have been convicted and condemned, and even lost the wars that they have tried to enact for what they see as their own righteous causes. And this was the particular point that I really wanted to focus on heavily, because this whole section really fascinated me, and it tied back to a lot of my own knowledge about history as well. And I'll read it here. A vivid example was provided in Dan Bar-On's book, which consists of interviews with children of the Third Reich. One of the women, Renata, told about her father, who was arrested nearly 2 decades after the war ended. She said her father complained about being arrested and persecuted when others, who had done far worse things, went free. He expressed humiliation that he, a decent and proper German who had always done his best to serve his country effectively and had led a blameless, correct life, would find himself thrown in jail with common criminals. He had never even padded an expense account, and here he was being treated like an ordinary lowlife. Renata said she eventually became unable to bear his complaining, because even though there was some merit in his claims of being a victim, he never said anything at all to acknowledge what he had done wrong. He had been a leader of one of the Einsatzgruppen, the small contingents who moved through conquered territory in Russia and executed Jewish citizens by shooting them, long before the gas chambers and crematoriums were built. She said he never expressed any regret or remorse or compassion for the people he shot, and this fact eventually revolted her to the extent she could no longer even speak to him. The family began to regard her as a traitor because she failed to stand by her father in his time of trouble. She said she might have been able to support him if he had acknowledged some guilt or remorse, but he never did. He never mentioned his own guilt or admitted that he deserved punishment, while he constantly harped on how he was the undeserved victim of excessive persecution. Just finishing up my water. And I focused in on this particularly because it's a subject that I have looked into quite extensively myself. And Baumeister doesn't go into it, but that's why I wanted to bring out this particular sort of tangent here. Because I found it very interesting how this man stated that, right at the top here, her father complained about being arrested when others who had done far worse things went free. And in particular, he is referring to... Let me look back at my notes for a second. I went and looked up some of these things, and first of all, here it is. No, that's not what I want to see. This is what I want to see. No, that's not what I want to see. Sorry, I've messed up my tabs again for a second. Here we go. I won't read this entire thing because it's very long, but I want to read just the first couple of examples from it. And let me just tab over to it properly. Here it is. This is the Rosenberg Files, the Federal Ministry of Justice and the Nazi era. The Nazi dictatorship committed unthinkable crimes and brought great suffering upon Germany and the world. The collaboration of the judicial system and lawyers with the Nazi regime has meanwhile been well documented in previous academic studies. However, it had been an open secret that many lawyers who were guilty of crimes returned to West German government service after the foundation of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. The Independent Academic Commission set up to investigate how the Federal Ministry of Justice dealt with its Nazi past, the Rosenberg Project, undertook an intensive study of the continuity in terms of personnel and its consequences. Our ministry allowed researchers full access to all the files for the first time. The results were depressing. Of the 170 lawyers who held senior positions in the ministry between 1949 and 1973, 90 had been members of the Nazi Party and 34 had been members of the SA. More than 15% had even worked in the Nazi Reich Ministry of Justice before 1945. These figures highlight why the prosecution of Nazi crimes was impeded for so long, the suffering of the victims was ignored far too long, and many groups of victims, such as homosexuals or Sinti or Roma, suffered renewed discrimination in the Federal Republic of Germany. The perversion of justice during the Nazi era and the failure of the Federal Republic to carry out a critical study of the past make one thing quite clear. Lawyers today must be more than mere technicians of the law who enshrine in articles and enforce any political idea. Their aim should rather be to internalize and to live the values of our basic law, human dignity, freedom, and diversity. Knowledge about the past makes us sensitive to current violations of human rights and the rule of law. All German lawyers should be aware of the negative sides of the past among members of their profession in order to recognize what a great responsibility they bear for the present and the future. And that's not just the beginning. That's not just the first thing I looked up either. There's also... let me open my tabs. It would help if I actually had this up properly. And this was a report from the Christian Science Monitor, which also cites the Rosenberg Project as well, which goes into a bit more context from this as well. A new study says that half of all senior officials in Germany's justice ministry in the 1950s and 1960s were former Nazis. Where was the part? While U.S. authorities sought justice by putting 16 lawyers and jurists who played a role in the Nazi regime on trial in 1947, Germany tried one lone prosecutor after establishing the West German Federal Republic in 1949. Many of those working for the ministry in the post-war years came from backgrounds as lawyers or judges in Nazi Germany, and came to the department to provide legal advice as West Germany rebuilt itself. By coming together and closing ranks, the network of former Nazis not only protected one another from legal persecution, but also bound together to create the nation's laws. And as Mr. Maas, who is part of this project, said, the Nazi-era lawyers went on to cover up old injustice rather than to uncover it, and thereby created new injustice. And from a more off-the-cuff point of view, there's also the minor, tiny details that the vast majority of German scientists who were involved in the V1 and V2 rocket programs, as well as those that created the jet bomber and jet fighter programs, were all given amnesty and sanctuary in the United States. There was also Werner von Braun, or Buren, I forget exactly what his name is pronounced, but he was the architect of the V2 rocket program, and I think one of the famous quotes from him about the V2 rocket was, "The rocket worked perfectly, it just happened to land on the wrong planet." And he was very open about the fact that he collaborated with the Nazis his goal was to get to the moon. And he saw the best way to do that was to research rocket engines for the Nazi war regime. But because he was useful, the Americans gave him complete amnesty, and he was accepted into NASA, and he was a pivotal part of the space program. So just going back to our document here. Yes, this man, who was a member of the Einsatzgruppen, is very obviously worthy of total condemnation, because he was likely instrumental in murdering dozens, hundreds, perhaps at the absolute outside thousands of Jews. And yet, if we dare to apply nuance to this event, he was a foot soldier who was tasked to go out and perform a small part of the incredibly cruel, evil, and destructive plans that his seniors had created, had debated on, and decided were justified. He probably had no input on any of those decisions. He had the option to walk away, no doubt. I'm not excusing him. But at the same time, he does have a point when he says that other people who had done much worse than him were allowed to go free. The Nuremberg trials only condemned a tiny fraction of the Nazis who engaged in extraordinary war crimes. And people like Heinz Guderian were allowed to write many of the post-war histories of the Nazi invasion of the USSR. That's where myths like the Winter War came from. For example, that, it was General Winter that defeated the German army, and also the myth that the German army was the most motorized force in all of the world, that was led entirely by tanks, when in fact the Germans had like 5 to 10% of mechanized force and 95% millions of horses. So, I mean, if you're a member of these groups, Magdalena's Rex, we found photos of Speer working to construct the camps, but he managed to lie his way to being innocent and just following orders, and he got away with his crimes. Oh, hello, Armored Glass Cannon, by the way. Tom Lear had a song about von Braun. I'm afraid I don't know that song personally. Logistics led by horses. Yep, I mean, horses are very good at moving through difficult terrain, and they also have relatively low maintenance, and they also make more of themselves, and point me to a tank that can reproduce. But yeah, I found this a very interesting point simply because of the context that I'm aware of, given my own study and knowledge of history. And again, I am not trying to excuse a member of the Einsatzgruppen. However, what I'm pointing out is, just like Baumeister points out here, in general then, the myth of pure evil conceals the reciprocal causality of violence. And by doing so, it probably increases the violence. And I think that, yeah, that's literally the end of the chapter, so I'll just read this last bit. Thus, the myth of pure evil confers a kind of moral immunity on people who believe in it. As we will soon see, belief in the myth is itself one recipe for evil, because it allows people to justify violent and oppressive actions. And I thought this was a very good point. It allows evil to masquerade as good. Tanks don't die when they think of ants. Is that something that horses do? I've got to Google this now. Do horses die when they think of ants? I'll be very disappointed if this... Ants and horses are warning. What the hell? U/leader654 explains how horses are actively trying to die. Okay, that's not it. Would you prefer horses with the size of ants or ants with the size of horses? Yeah, I'm afraid I can't find any evidence of horses dying when they think of ants, Kenneth Patterson. I'm very sorry. Anyway, we are now at the end of this chapter. Allow me to resist the autistic urge to speak into this bottle cap. And, I think I might delay the next part, the next chapter, because because of the doing the extra research for Friday, I haven't had as much time to actually read and analyze the next chapter. So I think that I will delay that stream until Wednesday as opposed to doing it on Monday. Kenneth Patterson, the joke is that it's really easy for horses to spook themselves into an accident that breaks their leg or something that kills themselves. Yeah, I can understand that. I like horses, actually. I've never learned to ride. I think I should, though. I would love to learn how to ride. That would be a nice thing to do. I want to learn how to ride, and I want a suit of battle-ready chainmail. Those are the kind of things that I want at the moment. Very, very natural, logical goals in life. I really want a suit of chainmail, guys. I don't know why. Occasionally, every few months, I just get this urge to buy a suit of chainmail. Unfortunately, it's really hard to find a supplier that would actually give me a decent suit, because I don't want just a crap suit of butted chainmail. I want proper riveted or welded chainmail that is actually capable of absorbing a blow. Because I want it functional. I definitely don't want just a cheap suit of looking chainmail for LARP or stuff like that. But I happen to have extraordinarily broad shoulders, and all of my clothing is XL size as a result. You need to move to New Zealand and join Shadowversity's group. Shadowversity is kind of a weird guy, honestly. So, but I mean... I also find New Zealanders to be insane, collectively mad, which is really, it puts me off going there. Every single person I've known from New Zealand has been just completely mad. They're a bit, I won't say they're like the Dutch, because I like the Dutch. The Dutch are crazy in a nice way, but the New Zealanders seem to be very, very weird. It's extraordinarily weird. Anyway, guys, it is coming up to 3 hours of streaming time, and I can start to feel a headache coming on, and I am also freezing cold. My feet are really, 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 really chilly, and so I am going to call it a night here now that we have finally reached the end of this chapter. I believe that I will be streaming on Wednesday next week as opposed to Monday, because Monday gives me exactly 2 days of fairly busy time to read through another 30 pages of information. So, yeah, I think I'm going to need a few extra days in order to properly analyze the stuff that we're doing through. How weird are New Zealanders? Ask me again on Wednesday, okay, and I will explain. I'm afraid that my throat is not quite good enough to manage it right now. Please let me look briefly on my stuff. No, we're good. Okay. I will go and answer the numerous numbers of DMs that I've now got. So I will say goodnight to everyone here. I do thank you all very much for coming and putting up with my unusual streaming schedule, especially when Kirsche is live. And I know many of my audience also likes to watch Kirsche as well. Thank you very much, Damned Lurker. Thanks again for the stream, Proctor. You're more than welcome. I'm just glad that people are still watching and still enjoying my content. And next week, hopefully, we will have a bit of a smoother transition into the next chapter, which, what's it called again? The 4 Roots of Evil. That is... Wait, that's that part, not the chapter. Chapter 4, Greed, Lust, Ambition. Evil as a Means to an End. So that is the title of the next stream. So I will see you all next time. Thank you very much, guys. Good night for now. End of the Thine stream.